A virgin mountain man awaited his bride, but the one who came was nothing like he imagined. The parched dust of Dry Creek clung to the boots of Jacob Thorne as he dragged his daughter forward. The sun beat down mercilessly, baking the settlement into silence. Eliza stumbled, her heavy frame drawing stares as sharp as knives. "She's 16, Jacob barked, thrusting her toward the wagon. "Big enough to work, too stubborn to listen. I'll trade her for coin before I starve." The crowd muttered, some with pity, others with cruel amusement. Eliza's cheeks burned, but she kept her eyes down. She had long grown used to the whispers, too large, too clumsy, too wild, but never before had her shame been paraded so brazenly. From the shadows stepped Silas. His frame filled the street, towering and scarred, his beard dark as storm clouds. Men parted, mothers pulled children close. The mountain man was a legend whispered of in fear, an outcast who lived where the cliffs met the sky. He studied Eliza with eyes like flint, unreadable. Then he turned to Jacob. "How much?" His voice was low, flat, dangerous. Jacob shoved a grubby hand forward. "A bag of coin will do." Without hesitation, Silas untied a leather pouch from his belt and dropped it into Jacob's palm. The weight made Jacob's eyes gleam. He didn't look back at his daughter once as he staggered away, already counting. Eliza stood frozen, her breath shallow. She expected mockery, cruelty, chains. Instead, Silas reached into his pack, drew out a flask of water, and held it out to her. "Drink," he said. It was not kindness. It was survival. And survival, Eliza realized as she lifted the flask with shaking hands, was all that mattered now. The water was warm from the sun, yet to Eliza it tasted like salvation. She swallowed greedily before realizing Silas still watched her, his expression unreadable. Embarrassed, she lowered the flask and wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. "Come," he said simply, turning toward the waiting mule and wagon. His words carried no malice, no warmth either, only command, the voice of a man long accustomed to being obeyed by silence and necessity. Eliza hesitated. Behind her, the townsfolk began to disperse. Some shook their heads, whispering about her father's cruelty. Others smirked, already imagining what fate awaited her in the wilderness with a man like Silas. Their voices buzzed in her ears like flies. She had no choice. Clutching the flask against her chest, she followed him. He lifted her onto the wagon seat with one powerful arm, then swung up beside her. The mule lurched forward, pulling them out of Dry Creek and into the harsh expanse beyond. Eliza was 16, but her broad frame and restless spirit made her seem older. Years of labor on her father's failed farm had thickened her arms, and long hours in the sun had bronzed her skin. She was not delicate, not dainty like the girls she'd watched giggle at dances. Her strength, instead of being praised, had been branded a curse. Her father had called her ox, burden, useless weight. Now, with the coin clinking in his pocket, he had cast her away. Beside her sat Silas, a man wrapped in his own silence. His sheer size made her shrink against the wagon's edge. The scars across his cheek and temple looked like the claw marks of some great beast. His hands, gripping the reins, were thick and calloused, each finger marked by old burns and cuts. Rumors of him drifted through Dry Creek like smoke. Some said he had killed a man with a single blow. Others whispered he had once been a preacher or a soldier or even an outlaw hiding from the hangman's noose. Children dared each other to sneak to the edge of the cliffs to glimpse the smoke from his fire. Few claimed to have spoken to him. Now, Eliza sat inches away, every breath tight in her chest. She waited for him to sneer at her, to laugh, to remind her that she was nothing but a trade made for coin. Instead, he only flicked the reins and muttered to the mule. The silence stretched, but it was not cruel. It was steady, like the mountains themselves. The land shifted as they rode. Cracked soil gave way to sparse sagebrush, then to canyons carved by ancient floods. Vultures wheeled overhead, their shadows sweeping across the wagon. The air smelled of dust and juniper. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. Eliza clutched the buffalo coat tighter around her shoulders. She had been cast into a wilderness she did not understand, with a man she could not yet trust. But even as fear gnawed at her, a strange thought stirred. Perhaps, away from her father's scorn and the town's ridicule, she might discover who she truly was. Beside her, Silas's profile cut against the sinking sun, harsh, scarred, resolute. He had not bought her to torment her, not yet. And for the first time, she wondered if there was more to him than the monster the townsfolk described. The wagon rolled onward until the sun slid behind the ridges, painting the sky in bruised purples and deepening gold. The road narrowed into little more than a trail, its ruts carved by wagon wheels long abandoned. Each jolt rattled through Eliza's bones, but she kept silent, afraid that any word might draw his attention. As night descended, Silas pulled the mule off the path into a shallow hollow rimmed with junipers. Without a word, he unhitched the mule, set out a feed bag, and struck flint to kindling. Sparks caught, and soon a fire flickered, casting light over his scarred face. Eliza sat stiffly on a rock, clutching the edges of the buffalo coat. Hunger gnawed at her, but she said nothing. She had learned that complaining only earned ridicule. To her surprise, Silas tore a strip of jerky in half and held it out. "Eat." She took it with trembling fingers. The meat was tough, salty, but it filled the hollow ache in her stomach. He drank from a canteen and passed it to her without ceremony. The silence between them stretched, filled only by the crackle of flames and the distant yip of coyotes. When the fire burned steady, Silas spoke. "Tomorrow we climb." She blinked, startled to hear his voice again. "Climb? The canyon trail, steep, narrow, you'll walk." His tone carried no threat, only fact. Eliza swallowed, her heart thudding. She had never walked farther than the boundaries of her father's dying farm, but she nodded, unwilling to show fear. That night she lay wrapped in the coat, the hard ground beneath her. Sleep came fitful, broken by dreams of her father's sneer and the weight of coins clinking in his hands. Each time she woke, she saw Silas by the fire, broad-shouldered and still, his rifle across his knees, a sentinel carved of stone. At dawn, they began the climb. The trail wound upward through red rock canyons, the walls closing in so tight the mules' packs scraped stone. Loose gravel slid beneath Eliza's boots, and sweat dampened her brow. She stumbled more than once, expecting a barked command, a lash of temper. But Silas only slowed his steps, letting her find balance. When her breath hitched, he pointed toward a trickle of water seeping from the rocks. "Drink there, clean." Later, he plucked a sprig of green from the canyon floor, crushing it between his fingers. "Yarrow stops bleeding. Remember it." The lessons startled her. He spoke sparingly, yet each word was weighty, deliberate. She realized he was not dragging her into wilderness to break her. He was showing her how to endure it. By midday, her legs shook with exhaustion. They paused in the shade of a boulder. Silas handed her a strip of dried apple. She chewed slowly, watching him crouch to repair a broken strap on the mule's pack. The scars across his arms and neck gleamed in the sun. They spoke of battles she could not imagine, of a life marked by hardship. For the first time, curiosity stirred stronger than fear. Who was this man who had chosen silence over cruelty? Why had he bought her only to treat her with a stern, quiet dignity? As the afternoon waned, they reached a ledge that opened onto a vista of staggering beauty. Pines blanketed the slopes below, and far in the distance, the ribbon of a river shimmered. Eliza caught her breath, awe pushing aside her dread. Silas glanced at her, eyes narrowing not in scorn, but in some unreadable measure, perhaps to see if she would cower or rise to the challenge. And though her body ached and her heart still feared, Eliza lifted her chin. The girl who had been sold like cattle in Dry Creek was still with him, but already something else was taking root, a spark of resilience she had never known she possessed. By the third evening, when Eliza's legs ached so fiercely she thought she could walk no further, Silas finally pointed toward a cleft in the ridge. There, hidden against the mountainside, stood a cabin of squared logs. Smoke curled from its chimney, faint but steady, carrying the scent of pine resin and stew. Eliza's heart lurched. She had imagined a cave, a dark den where she might be chained or worse. Instead, the cabin looked lived in, tended. A small shed leaned against the slope, and a fenced patch of soil, bare now but marked with last year's furrows, hinted at a garden. Silas led the mule into a lean-to, unloaded supplies, and gestured toward the door. Inside. Eliza hesitated on the threshold. The single room glowed with lamplight, revealing a wide hearth of stone, shelves stacked with jars and dried herbs, and a sturdy table scarred by years of use. A ladder rose to a loft where quilts were neatly folded. The air was warm, tinged with cedar smoke. "You'll sleep up there," Silas said. "My bed stays below." The words startled her. She had braced for the worst, yet here was a man drawing lines of safety between them. She climbed the ladder slowly, pressing a hand to the rough-hewn wood of the railing. The loft mattress was stuffed with straw, layered with heavy blankets. She sank down, trembling from fatigue, but for the first time in days, not from fear. Life in the cabin soon fell into rhythm. At dawn, Silas split wood outside, while she swept the floor with a broom of bundled twigs. He showed her how to fetch water from a spring higher up the slope, how to gather pine boughs to line the goat's pen. Her arms ached, but each task grounded her in a way she had never known on her father's barren farm. Meals were simple: beans, cornbread, strips of venison. Silas never heaped her plate with mockery, never sneered at the way she ate. He simply portioned food, then ate his own. Once, when she burned a pan of biscuits bracing for ridicule, he only scraped away the charred edges and said, "Try again tomorrow." Evenings were quieter still. Silas sat near the fire, mending harness or sharpening tools, while Eliza discovered a small trove of books on a shelf, a Bible, an old geography, a tattered collection of frontier tales. She read softly to herself until her voice grew steadier. Sometimes she caught him listening, though he never commented. In time, she began to hum as she worked, old songs her mother had once sung. At first, the sound felt strange in the solemn cabin, but it filled the silence with something alive. Silas never interrupted. One stormy night, wind howled through the pines, rattling shutters. A frightened goat broke loose, stumbling into the cabin half-soaked. Eliza wrapped it in quilts by the hearth, rubbing its sides until it bleated in protest. When she glanced up, she saw Silas watching, the corner of his mouth twitching, not quite a smile but close. She found courage to ask questions. "Why live up here alone?" she whispered once, emboldened by firelight. Silas's scarred face darkened. He set aside his knife, staring into the flames. "Because the world below takes more than it gives." She did not press him, but she stored the words like precious stones. With each passing day, her shame began to loosen. The broad shoulders, the calloused hands, the body she had always despised proved strong in the mountains. She hauled buckets, chopped kindling, kneaded dough until her arms trembled. For the first time, her strength was not mocked, but necessary. At night, lying in the loft beneath heavy quilts, she whispered into the dark, "Maybe I was not sold into ruin. Maybe I was carried here to become someone new." Below, Silas shifted in his chair, the firelight etching the scars on his face. He said nothing, but in the hush of the mountains, silence felt less like a prison and more like a pact. Spring thaw came late in the high country. Snow retreated in stubborn patches, leaving the ground wet and raw. For Eliza, each day in the cabin peeled away a layer of fear, but it also stirred questions she no longer could ignore. One evening, after hauling water until her shoulders ached, she found Silas bent over a battered map spread across the table. Marks scrawled in charcoal traced valleys and ridges she didn't recognize. He looked up sharply when she entered, then rolled the map away. "What were you studying?" she asked, emboldened by weeks of his quiet fairness. "Nothing you need fret about," he muttered, but his evasive tone lingered in her ears long after she climbed to the loft. Days later, she discovered a folded document wedged between books on the shelf, a deed of sale written in her father's rough hand. The words seared her. One daughter, Eliza Thorne, traded for coin. Her stomach turned. She had been nothing more than livestock to Jacob. When Silas saw her holding the paper, his jaw tightened. "Best burn that," he said. But instead of tossing it into the fire, he took it from her and tore it cleanly in two. The sound split the silence. "That claim is dead. You're no man's property." The words struck deeper than the act itself. For the first time, Eliza believed them, yet the world below had not forgotten her. Miss Agnes, a gray-haired widow from the hidden canyon community Silas sometimes visited, arrived one afternoon with grim news. A local land baron had placed a bounty on Silas's head, calling him a squatter and a thief. Rumors spread that Jacob, broke again, was whispering to hired guns, offering to lead them straight to the mountain man and to the daughter he had lost. Eliza's heart clenched. "He'll come for me." Silas's eyes darkened. "Then he'll find I'm not alone anymore." But fear crept into her nights. She dreamed of Jacob's hand gripping her arm, of being dragged back into the dust and jeers of Dry Creek. Each morning she woke with resolve hardening inside her. She would never return. Silas sensed her unease. Instead of comfort, he gave her tools. He placed an old musket in her hands and showed her how to load powder, how to steady her breath. He taught her to set snares, to move silently through pines, to read the sky for storms. "You're stronger than you know," he said one dusk as she struck flint and coaxed a fire to life. "Your father saw only burden. I see something else." Her chest ached at the words, ache that was both wound and balm. Still, whispers of conflict grew louder. A rider was spotted near the lower ridge. Tracks of 2 horses crossed their trail to the spring. Every sound of distant gunfire echoed too close. One evening, Eliza stood on the cabin's small porch, staring down the darkening valley. Fear still twisted inside her, but beneath it burned something sharper. Defiance. She was no longer the girl who cowered in the square while her father bartered her dignity. She had learned to split wood, to steady her aim, to claim her worth. When Silas came to stand beside her, his presence solid as the mountain itself, she whispered, "Let him come. This time he will not take me." The mountain night carried her vow into the pines, and for the first time Silas's scarred face broke into something like a smile, not of joy, but of recognition. She had become what he'd known she could be all along, unbroken. The warning came with the crack of a rifle echoing through the canyon. Chickens scattered in a frenzy, and the mule brayed from the shed. Eliza froze with the water bucket in her hands until Silas's voice cut sharp through the air. Inside, now. She dropped the bucket and scrambled to the cabin as Silas strode out, rifle in his grip, his broad frame a dark silhouette against the rising sun. Dust rose from the trail below. 3 riders pushed their horses hard toward the homestead. At their head was Jacob Thorne, his face gaunt with drink and desperation, eyes blazing with cruel triumph. Flanking him were 2 hired guns, rifles slung and mouths twisted in smirks. "Silas Maddox," Jacob bellowed, "you've got what's mine. Hand her over, and maybe I'll let you keep that shack another season." From the doorway, Eliza gripped the musket Silas had taught her to load. Fear rattled her ribs, but her hands were steady. She stepped onto the porch before he could stop her, raising her voice so the whole canyon could hear. "I am not yours. You sold me. You cast me aside. I owe you nothing." The rider slowed, uncertain. Jacob's sneer faltered as he saw the musket braced against her shoulder. For the first time in his life, he saw not the clumsy girl he had mocked, but a young woman with fire in her eyes. "You'll regret that, girl," he spat, but his voice cracked. Behind her, the door creaked open. Neighbors from the hidden canyon community spilled into the yard. Agnes with her walking stick, young Caleb with one eye, Marta leaning on her crutch. Scarred, limping, bent, but every one of them carried a weapon. They spread out silently behind Silas and Eliza, a wall of defiance. The hired guns shifted uneasily. One muttered, "Ain't worth it, Jacob. Too many." But Jacob, wild with pride, shoved his horse forward. "She's mine." Eliza stepped off the porch, musket steady, voice strong. "You lost me the moment you sold me. You'll never touch me again." The silence cracked like a whip. The hired guns turned their mounts, spitting curses, unwilling to die for a drunk's folly. Dust rose as their horses thundered away down the canyon, leaving Jacob alone. His shoulders sagged. For the first time, he looked small, hollowed out. He spat in the dirt, his fury drained. "You'll come crawling back, girl. You'll see." But Eliza only lowered her musket, her gaze hard as iron. "No, you'll never see me again." Jacob wheeled his horse and vanished into the haze of the valley, a broken man chasing ghosts. The yard fell silent save for the wind in the pines. Eliza's hand shook now that it was over, but Silas's steady hand closed over hers, lowering the musket. "You stood taller than the mountain today," he murmured, and for the first time she believed him. When the dust of Jacob's retreat finally settled, The yard seemed to exhale. Chickens crept back from their hiding places, and the mule shook its head, calm, returning like a slow tide. Eliza lowered the musket to her side, her arms trembling now that the danger had passed. Inside the cabin, the fire still burned steady. Silas guided her back to the hearth, pressing a tin cup of water into her hands. She drank, her throat raw, her mind replaying every moment, her father's fury, the guns turning back, the silence when she declared her freedom. "You did not flinch," Silas said quietly. His scarred face was softened by the glow. "You faced him, and you won." Eliza set the cup down, her eyes stinging. "I thought my knees would give way, but I couldn't. I wouldn't let him own me again." He nodded, nothing more. Yet the look in his eyes, steady, unwavering, told her what words never could. That night, the cabin was filled not with fear, but with something new. She mended a torn shirt by the fire while Silas checked the rifle. Outside, the pines whispered under the moonlight. For the first time, the wilderness no longer felt like exile. It felt like promise. Eliza glanced around the simple cabin, the loft where she slept, the shelves lined with jars, the fire that warmed her bones. She thought of the scarred, limping neighbors who had stood for her, of Silas tearing the deed in half, of the strength she had found within herself. "This is home now," she whispered. Silas lifted his gaze from the rifle. "If you choose it." And she knew she had. "Every time I read your comments, I'm reminded that stories like Eliza's belong to all of us, the cast out, the doubted, the ones told we are not enough." Her journey through fire and wilderness is not only about survival, but about claiming dignity no one can steal. If you've ever felt overlooked, know that you are stronger than the voices that tried to silence you. Tell me, where in the world are you listening from tonight? Share your place, your story. And if you still believe love and courage can bloom even in the harshest deserts, stay close. The next tale is on its way.